OEH seminar for Friday, November 4th, 2016. For the online people, if it is not November 4th, 2016, you are in the wrong space-time dimension. All right, I would like to introduce Robert Tsin. He's one of us, current Master of Science student at the SPPH OEH program. He has an undergraduate degree in environmental sciences from the UBC, and his supervisor is Dr. Sarah Henderson and Dr. Michael Bauer.
Thanks, Eric. Okay, perfect. So my thesis is on microscale heat variability mapping in Greater Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. And when I refer to heat, I mostly talk about air temperatures for my study. And so extreme heat has various health effects of prolonged exposure. Heat cramps, heat exhaustion, heat syncope, which means fainting, heat stroke, and even death. And infants and children are more vulnerable because they are less likely to know they're suffering symptoms, or they might be less able to communicate that they're feeling these symptoms, and they also heat up faster because they're smaller. And also, elderly are more vulnerable due to slower blood flow, so they cool down slower, due to the possibility of maybe taking medicines that cause dehydration, so they'll be more vulnerable to heat, due to the fact that they're less able to perceive temperature, they may have mobility issues, and they might be more socially isolated. So, but these impacts are usually only felt during extreme heat events or consecutive days where air temperature threshold is exceeded, with the threshold depending on the location. And these events usually occur when high pressure system is present, trapping hot air in the area for days or weeks at a time. And these events have had huge public health impacts. 700 deaths in Chicago, 3,000 plus deaths in Europe in 4 months, and 15,000 recently in Russia. But why worry about this in Vancouver, since we're usually more known for our rain than our heat? Well, we've had extreme heat events here before. In summer 2009, there was a heat event within a week that killed 110 people, or 40% above the normal baseline. This also killed more people in BC than swine flu did in that year when there was a pandemic. And as well, we worry about heat in Vancouver because we're in a temperate climate, so we are less acclimatized to heat. We spend most of the year at very low temperatures. We look at a monthly mean temperature chart, and also we have less mitigation resources such as air conditioning and public water fountains. Quick show of hands here. Who actually has air conditioning at their homes here in the audience? So less than 10%. BC average is 21%. And as well, there's a threat of climate change. 15 of the 16 record years that are the warmest were after year 2000. If you look at the table here, and the last 2015 and 2014 were the last two warmest years on record. And NASA scientists are 99% certain that 2016 will be the warmest year on record yet. So 1, 2, and 3 will be 2016, 2015, 2014. And so understanding heat distributions is important to mitigating climate impact or heat wave impacts. So current research includes satellite studies on land surface temperature, vehicle measurements of air temperature in urban areas for mostly urban heat island studies. And there's also models on heat distributions that use fixed station data and various geographic variables. But most of these models have not been verified on the microscale. So that's what my study aims to address. So my study goals are to evaluate the utility of microscale heat monitoring, evaluate whether models that show microscale variability actually represent actual conditions, and this is useful for epidemiological studies, provide more detailed data for Greater Vancouver, evaluate which geographic variables affect air temperature in Greater Vancouver, and also evaluate the use of video data as both for mainly generating more useful information. Since I had video data from my sampling, which I'll talk about later. So my data collection, I collected my data between May and September 2014 during that summer. on its hottest hours of the day, so between 3 to 6 p.m. Usually sampling took 2 to 3 hours, depending on the route. And I sampled on hot, non-overcast days, so usually on days that were above 22 degrees at the YVR Environment Canada station. So I conducted my sampling on foot for ease of navigating the road network as a pedestrian, and I can see smiles in the crowd. Yeah, it's not a compact sampling setup. So I had 2 thermometers, so the white one and the yellow one on the left image, a GPS which is on the clipboard, which I'm holding on the right picture, and a GoPro video camera on my left shoulder as shown in the right picture. And for my sites, I selected 20 routes throughout Greater Vancouver. They were selected based on air temperature, population density, and income because on a 75th percentile, 75th percentile for air temperature and population density, and the lower 25th percentile for income because warmer air temperatures, more impacts. Higher population density means more people are impacted if I sample in those areas, and people with lower income or have less resources to deal with or mitigate heat-related health impacts. So sampling those areas is more useful. So some of my results. This shows my mobile data measurements in red and the nearest fixed site measurements in blue. And as an example, I'll show one of my routes, route 15. As you can see in both runs, there's similar patterns in the air temperatures, but they're not exactly the same, which tells us that fixed site air temperatures can't fully represent the surrounding spatial air temperatures, and which means that 2 things mainly. That a lot of models use fixed site air temperatures to predict or model health impacts. So if you use microscale air temperatures, it will probably give better results. And in the practical case for my study, it means that I'm more interested in spatial air temperature variation than temporal. So if I want to see the spatial air temperature variations, I need to correct for the temporal air temperature variation. And that was an example from one route, but this applies for most of my data. So to correct for the short-term air temperature variations, I use this equation, and the correction data I use is from the reference site at YVR Airport with Metro Vancouver's data, since they had 1 minute frequency data. And to give a better idea of what the equation actually means. Above a numerator, it's my raw data. Each raw data point is divided by the following in the below equation. So the Tref site rolling means the average air temperature at the fixed site 15 minutes prior and 15 minutes after to the raw data point when the raw data point was collected, and the reference site run mean is the reference site air temperature for the entire run. And this is to remove the short-term temporal variation again. And once the short-term temporal variation was removed, I compared my run-adjusted air temperature data to Landsat land surface temperature data. This was done for 3 runs because out of all the data I collected in the summer, so I had a total of 42 runs from 20 sites. Only 3 matched with Landsat overpass days that were also not cloudy. So what's actually plotted? On the x-axis is my mobile air temperature data, and on the y-axis is the Landsat land surface temperature data. And so what the results I got were the R squared I calculated was between 0.04 and 0.38, which is a lot lower than what previous studies calculated, which was usually between 0.64 to 0.87. And this is mainly because of 2 reasons. one, I have spatial like even with the correction. Oh, actually, yeah. Well, I have spatial variation in my data because of how like this is mobile data. Most other studies use data from a fixed site, so like a fixed site with data from usually months to years worth of data. So they have a lot more data to work with, and they then introduce spatial variation. And this table also shows my correlations of my mobile run data with land surface temperature data from 3 different overpass days. And what this, and basically what this shows is that the air temperature data correlates with land surface temperature from different days, like with varying strengths. But the point of the table is to show that the correlations are, for the most part, location driven. I also compared my run-adjusted air temperature data with a model that was created by a researcher that modeled air temperature data in Greater Vancouver. I think this was actually published this year. The dependent variables that he used was fixed station air temperature, and the independent variables include distance from the ocean, elevation, land surface temperature, normalized difference water index, which is both a greenness and humidity index built into one, sky view factors, so how much of the sky is visible unobstructed when you're looking up from a certain area, solar radiation, and water vapor. But we're more interested in relative air temperature instead of absolute air temperatures, with how the study was done, like or how my study was done, we collected air temperature data throughout 4 months of the summer. So if we used absolute air temperature, our comparison wouldn't really work because we'd be getting air temperatures much low, like all air temperatures are much lower than what is modeled because the model was created to model air temperature on a typical hot summer day. So we had to calculate we're more interested in relative air temperatures. So we measured our measured air temperatures and the modeled air temperatures from the model are both converted to z-scores for each run. So what a z-score is basically it tells you how many standard deviations each data point is from the run means. So for example, if we had a z-score of 1, it means that value is 1 standard deviation away from the mean of that run or that distribution. So once we did that, we subtracted the model and mobile run z-scores to compare our relative air temperatures and calculate our z-score differential, which can tell us if the model did a good job predicting air temperatures. So this is a pretty busy plot. What it means is if it's white, then the z-score differential is within plus or minus 1 standard deviation, or in other words, we assume it predicted air temperature relatively well. If it's red, it means it's over 1, which means the model probably over-predicted air temperature, and if it's under 1, it means the model probably under -1, sorry. It means the model probably under-predicted air temperature. And to give a better idea of what this actually means, again, we're using 115, so the white parts of the route indicate that the model predicted air temperature well in these areas, but there's also some systematic biases in the red and the blue areas. So in the red areas, it means it over-predicted air temperature, the model over-predicted air temperature, and in the blue areas, it means the model under-predicted air temperature. So what our results tell us is that the model generally did a good job of predicting air temperature since around 57% of the cells are white. But There's also a lot of inconsistencies between runs. For example, if we look at run 4B and 4C in the top left corner, it doesn't, like, 4C under predicts air temperature in the top left corner, but in 4B it doesn't do that. And part of this is because we did our measurements throughout 4 months of the summer, so there's usually about a month or two between measurements at our routes, so there's inconsistencies between measurements. And to confirm this, we also compared our route replicates. So each route had at least 2 replicates. Some routes had 3, depending. And what this means, or what we actually did, so again, route 15 as the example, I compared my June 3rd replicate A to my July 28th replicate B. We compared the Z-scores and calculated correlation to determine how well they relate. And 0.67 is one of my higher values. Typically in the literature, 0.7 or higher is considered a good correlation, but for most of my routes, the correlation is below 0.7. I think it ranges from 0.01 to 0.83, and only one route was, and the 0.83 route was the only one I was above 0.7. So my correlations are between routes are generally not very strong, and this tells us 2 things. It tells us that, like, we, again, like measuring like throughout 4 months, it's hard to correct for that long-term air temperature variation. And more importantly, if I was to do this again or to do future studies on this, I would recommend measuring fewer routes but having more replicates to have a better idea of what the actual air temperature distribution at each route is. So the next step of, everything before was in one of the papers that I recently submitted and finally went through review after a few months. But my next step is to build land use regression models using my run adjusted air temperature data, using distance from the ocean, normalized difference, water index, population density, and sky view factor as independent variables. And the goal of this is to determine if certain areas of Greater Vancouver can be more or less accurately modeled by air temperature models, and possibly determine why that's the case. So we have individual run models. So I'm creating models for each of my runs individually, and creating an overall model for Greater Vancouver. Part of why we're doing individual run models is, again, because of how air temperature data collection was conducted throughout 4 months. So it's hard to have a good overall model, and preliminary results kind of show that's the case. The overall model for all of Greater Vancouver only has R-squared value of 0.05, while the individual run models have R-squared values ranging from 0.07 to 0.78. And how I built these models was basically taking the variable with the highest R-squared value and using that as a base model, and then adding variables as long as they added an R-squared of at least 0.01 until adding models doesn't really add any more predictive power. So not all models have 4 variables. Most have at least 2. And yeah, this is still ongoing. These are preliminary results. I'm also, I don't have it in my slides, but I'm also building a best case scenario model at Route 13 in New West, because New Westminster has geolocated street tree data. So, and my preliminary results have shown that's useful for creating a stronger model, but I don't have the numbers here today. And as well, another student of Sarah is using my video data to generate extra variables. So what they're doing actually is pretty cool. They're extracting the greenness from like my video frames and basically calculating how much greenness is within each frame. And they're comparing that to my air temperature data. And so for example, upper one is an image of more greenness, and the left image is the video data, the right image is the extracted greenness, and it generally does a pretty good job. He's done a pretty good job of extracting only the greenness. So basically so he's extracted the data, and currently he's calculated correlations between my adjusted air temperature data and the greenness index, the greenness he's calculated. He's tried using basically greenness average from like just a frame to like 60 seconds of video data, and he's found negative correlations with air temperature for about 2/3 of the routes, which is what is expected because higher greenness should be correlated with lower temperatures, but a third of the routes are also positively correlated. And I think the next step is to use GPS data to determine why the correlations are the way they are. So going back through my study goals, to evaluate the utility of microscale heat monitoring, and so goals 1 and 2 have been completed and they're currently published. Goals 3 and 4 are ongoing. And they're what I need to finish to complete my thesis. And goal 5 is ongoing, but being worked on by someone else. So I'd like to thank my supervisors, committee members for all the guidance and help they've given so far. I'd like to thank Derek Ko, who was actually one of the authors of the model I was mentioning, for providing a lot of GIS data I was using. I'd like to thank Metro Vancouver for providing reference weather station data that I've used for a lot of my analyses, and I'd like to thank the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions and UBC for supporting my research to date. And these are just some references, and thank you very much. Let me know if there's any questions.
Hi, thank you, Robert.
Thank you, Robert. You've ended quite early, which means you're probably going to get quite a lot of questions, but that's okay. I just want to point out that Robert's paper's actually been accepted, and it should be published quite soon. He said that it was under review, and that's no longer true. There's one online question to start with, which somebody's asking, I'm not sure that I understand why the mobile data are so much different from the fixed site data. Can you go into that in a little more detail?
Okay, I'll go back to the slide first. So for the fixed site data, like the fixed site isn't moving. Like the mobile data, like I'm walking this route like in the span of an hour to 3 hours depending on the route, and because the area, like I'm basically walking through different urban areas, so there's areas of different varying geographic factors. So an area I'm walking through might be more built up or less built up, have more or less development, more trees or less trees, more exposure to the sun, and these are all variables that can affect air temperature distribution spatially, while the reference site is, well, it's a reference site, so it's stuck at one spot where there's no geographic variation, so all the variation there is temporal.
Thanks very much. An interesting project, and I missed the very beginning, so I'm not sure if the idea here is to look at heat stress or climate change. So maybe you can answer that. But thinking about it from perhaps a heat stress point of view, I think the previous slide shows all the different.
Yeah, or not this one.
Maybe one. Yeah. What struck me about this was that virtually every one of your measured mobile sites had higher temperature measurements than the fixed site, if I'm interpreting that right. The reds are higher than the blues. And so I wanted to hear about why that was. And I think, to me, that's an important thing for the heat stress issue. to know that fixed sites are underestimating the temperature. The other thing that struck me was I'm not surprised that you didn't find high relationships, because you really restrict by choosing times of day when the temperature is highest and a time of year when the temperature is highest. You're really restricting the variability in temperature a lot. You can kind of understand it if it's for heat stress, because that's what you care about, is the higher levels. But it doesn't give a chance for the much greater full year variability in temperature to be captured by both measures, and to look at the relationship for both measures. And I guess my second question is this typical of how these relationships are done, or do other studies actually look at year-long variability in fixed and mobile sites? So yeah, the first question is about the difference in temperature, and the second is about correlation.
Okay, to answer the first question, the difference between a mobile and fixed site is, well, actually kind of expected, because our mobile sites are in more urban areas, so more developed. So while the fixed sites they have like usually strict guidelines they have to follow as for meteorological stations. So they're usually in grass fields with very little to no buildings around them. So all variables that usually cause it to have lower air temperatures. And the fixed site is also at YVR Airport, so that's closer to coast. Or sorry, actually, it's mostly just because the fixed sites, the 4 fixed sites which are shown here are located in less developed, more grassy, more areas with more vegetation, which usually give lower air temperatures. And while my mobile sites are mostly in urban areas that are built up, have lots of concrete, so they're expected to have more higher air temperatures. And to answer the second question, this is like what I have is kind of expected, but no one's actually really compared mobile and fixed site air temperatures. So this is kind of new ground. Like our results are kind of expected, but no one's actually looked at it in the literature until now. A restricted. We're mainly interested in distributions of air temperatures during hotter hours and days, because that's when heat stress is most likely to affect people. So we restricted our analyses to those hours.
I want to follow up. So, but if you're trying to predict when people may have a heat stress event,
yeah,
from all the possible temperatures over a year, or maybe over the summer, don't you still want to include all that variability in temperature over, say, the summer months, to be able to see how well the fixed sites are able to alert you to problems? Yeah.
This is evaluating the fixed site isn't really like it was a nice bonus of doing this, of using our microscale air temperature measurements, but it isn't I guess it isn't a main objective of our study. We have a heat health warning system in Vancouver that was actually that was previously created to alert health authorities during possible heat events. But I guess to answer your question, evaluating this during the hot hours, I guess my measurements were only taken during the hot hours of the day due to limitations by logistics, and because this is the time of day which the impacts are probably the strongest, so that's why we restricted ourselves to looking at these variations.
Hi, Robert. Thanks. I'm interested in what you were talking about in terms of greenness extraction
Yeah.
from your video. And I'm sorry, I know this isn't specifically what you're doing, but I'm wondering if that's a technique that can differentiate between types of greenness. What I'm thinking is that you might have a video frame where you're walking next to new green shrubs and you'd get a high greenness index, but you might also be in another frame walking underneath a tree canopy in say a neighborhood with older trees. In the one with older trees with a high canopy, it might appear to be quite dark, so you get a lower greenness index out of your frame. But intuitively, we would think that, in fact, the temperature modulating effects of the tree cover would be greater in that second instance.
As far as I'm aware, I don't think it fully distinguishes. But like my video data, like half the frame is like the ground, and about half the frame is above the ground. So and like even if it's in a dark area, it can. I think the extraction process can still differentiate greenness even if it's shaded. So yes, the amount of greenness might. So I think the amount of greenness, it might not distinguish between the types of greenness, but in terms of amount, I think it should be able to pick that up. But yes, so.
I can comment further on this because I know a little bit more about the methods we use than Robert does. So far we've approached it fairly crudely, and we've taken all pixels that fall below a certain threshold and called them not green, and all that fall above a certain threshold and called them green, where that green includes some aspects of yellow as well, and a little bit of gray to pick up the green that's actually in shadow. So you can tailor it quite well as long as you have good data to validate the algorithm that you're using to pick out the colors. So I think, you know, in due time, we could certainly, and one of the things we've noticed is there's like a green car goes by in the video frame, and then the frame gets greener because that green car is there. So if you can sort of weed out the color of green cars, you can get rid of that sort of thing. So, you know, as long as you have the time to really develop what you're trying to do, I think pretty much almost anything is possible. There's another question here online, which was, did you look at how the results of the fixed sites compared with each other?
I did not in this for the Metro Vancouver sites, but I did something similar previously for Environment Canada and Metro Vancouver sites. Because Environment Canada is usually the standard used, but they didn't have minute-by-minute data, so I had to use Metro Vancouver's data. But when I compared Metro Vancouver's fixed sites with Environment Canada's fixed sites, the correlations were pretty high. And I expect them to be pretty high between Metro Vancouver stations too.
Hi there. I was just wondering how you chose your mobile sites, and also if you looked at all in sort of further out in the greater Vancouver area towards the valley where temperatures tend to be a little bit hotter.
I mainly focused on the lower mainland because in 1 second. Mainly in Vancouver, Richmond, parts of Burnaby, New West, because that's where the model that I compared against later modeled their air temperatures, and because most of the population is within Greater Vancouver and Lower Mainland, so doing my air temperature collection here in that area would, I guess, have results that impact or affect more people. And also logistics. I did this sampling throughout 4 months, so if I went out too far in the valley, I might not have been able to collect as many samples as I did for the campaign.
Yeah, I was just wondering, based off of the video data, like, did the degree of traffic and stuff in the neighborhoods you walked around have an influence in local temperatures? Like, I'm not sure about here, but like in Asia, you could, like, when you walk outside to a busy street, you could feel the heat from all the engines. So I'm not sure if it had like smaller effects here or if like the heat was able to get distributed much more readily.
There's definitely some effects. Like I don't have any, I guess, qualitative data on this, but I can say like when I walked, like one of the things I remember is if I walked past like a bunch of vehicles or bigger vehicles, the temperature would usually go up by a little bit.
Hey, another online question. I'm curious as to why relative humidity was not included in your mobile sampling or not included in the analysis. I would think that Humidex, which was mentioned early in your presentation, would be more relevant than dry temperature alone, and factors like greenness could potentially impact relative humidity.
Humidity was considered, but we stuck to air temperature only because it was simpler to measure and model that way. The model that we compared against, they also had a apparent temperature model, so both heat and humidity, but I guess the answer to that is for the sake of being able to do our measurements and get our results easily, and because humidity is sometimes and also because our yeah, I guess to answer the question, I would say ease of sampling and ease of displaying and modeling our results.
So just, can you talk about the two different temperature instruments that you carried?
Oh, yeah. So I had so the big white one here is that's actually that radiation shield, and inside the radiation shield is a thermometer that measures the air temperatures, and the yellow one is it's actually a Kestrel 4500, which is a mobile weather station that measures air temperature, and it actually also has humidity, but we only had this a month into sampling, and so we couldn't use the humidity data on there. As well, we didn't use the data on the Kestrel 4500 because it was a lot noisier than our other thermometers data.
Also, I'm not sure, and you can comment on this, did you have minute-by-minute humidity data from the Metro Vancouver?
Metro Vancouver? I don't think I requested it. I don't know if I think they have it, but we didn't request it at the time.
Just a question. As far as equipment, is it similar equipment used at the airport and other fixed stations?
Yeah, the white thermometer is what is typically used at most meteorological stations with the radiation shield. Yeah.
Okay. And did you also incorporate your body temperature just in the back?
Oh, that's a good question because we actually had a reviewer that asked about that. One of our committee members actually did a calculation. Basically, like I don't have the numbers, but basically, as long as I'm walking, the effect of body heat, mathematically shouldn't influence the thermometer more than 0.1 degrees, and plus like the thermometer is probably like I'd say a meter away from the body, and it's also shielded for radiative heat, so the impact should be minimal.
And just the biggest difference between temperature between fixed station, just curious, like downtown, is that just the most buildings, right?
It has the most buildings, but it's also really close to water, so the difference between the fixed and the mobile, it varies depending on which part of downtown you're in.
Okay. Yeah. And any reports of just like the fatalities or the? Is there any? Are you going to correlate that at all, location-wise? I don't know if that's.
That's out of
like
the scope of
inpatient at the hospitals, maybe, or.
that's out of scope of my study, but there's been another study that used a similar heat model like the one I evaluated and evaluated heat mortality using those results. Yeah. But my data, hopefully, like my results will be used for heat mitigation purposes and planning by government agencies. But yeah, that's the hope.
All right, I'm just going to wrap it up. Thanks for bringing the heat, Robert. That was awesome.
Thanks for listening.